Ladies and gentlemen, as you will note from a release from the press office, I will leave on the 23rd of this month for a trip to Europe, which will take me to Brussels, to London, to Berlin and Bonn, to Rome and to Paris. I will be accompanied on the trip by the Secretary of State, Mr. Rogers, and by my advisor for national security affairs, Dr. Kissinger. The purpose of the trip I will describe as being a working trip rather than a protocol trip. I plan to see in each of the countries I visit the head of government, and in addition to that, I will have a visit with the members of our United States delegation in Paris, headed by Ambassador Lodge, and we'll have a meeting with Pope Paul in Rome. While I'm in Brussels, I will see leaders of the NATO community. As far as the agenda is concerned for these meetings, it is wide open. I have some ideas about the future of the European community, which I will discuss, and I am sure that my colleagues in that community have some ideas that they will want to discuss. I have requested that, in addition to the usual group meetings which will take place, that I have an opportunity to have an individual face-to-face meeting with each head of government, with no one present except a translator when needed. As I look at this trip and what it may accomplish, I want to make very clear that this is only a first step in achieving a purpose that I have long felt is vital to the future of peace for the United States and for the world, and that is the strengthening and revitalizing of the American-European community. This will be the first, I would hope, of several meetings of this type that will take place in the years ahead. And I would trust that as a result of this meeting and as a result of other meetings that will take place, that this great alliance, which in my view has been the greatest force for peace, to keep the peace over the last 20 years, this great alliance, which was brought together by a common fear 20 years ago, will be held together now and strengthened by a common sense of purpose.
Hello, everyone, and good evening. Welcome to our first in-person Nixon Seminar on Conservative Realism and National Security, hosted by the Nixon Foundation here at the beautiful Presidential Library in Yorba Linda, California. Thanks to everybody in the in-person audience and to all of you who are listening in online. Thank you for sharing your time with us this evening. I'm Mary Kissel of Stevens Inc. I'm a member of the seminar and your host tonight, and we're very honored to have Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador O'Brien as our co-chairs, co-chairing the discussion, and we're thrilled to have back all of our seminar members, most of whom are here in person, but we also have a few joining us online. So as you might be able to tell from the video clip that we just played tonight, we're going to talk about something positive amid all the chaos in the world. We're going to talk about the emerging opportunities that we have with our alliance partners around the world and the core elements, shall we say, of a long-term national strategy for our foreign policy for the new age that we find ourselves in. So with that, I'm going to ask Secretary Pompeo to my right to kick it off. Sir, if you want to make a few opening comments, or maybe I can just feed you something. I mean, the Ukraine war. There's so many problems to talk about around the world. Well, let's start with the biggest one, the war on the continent of Europe. Europe seems to have woken up. Does this give us a chance to do more with them? Over to you.
You know, Mary, I think it does. I agree that it seems that they have been awakened. It took this crisis to do that. I hope it's not temporary. I hope it's not jailhouse conversion that ends at sentencing, right? Where when they feel like it's over, they go back and revert to their normative ways of the last decade where they just didn't do enough to protect and prevent and deter precisely what this is. The last thought I'd say about something I think has fundamentally changed is I think the economic connection between both all of Europe and all of the West is now very plain. Not just the energy issue that I'm sure we'll spend time on, which is going to be a really very difficult problem over the next 20 to 90 days in Europe. They're paying multiples of what we're paying here in the United States for energy, but also the financial markets You can see the interconnectedness as resources are moved away from China and moved to other markets. You can see the interconnectedness, whether that's in Frankfurt or London or New York. We can each see that. And I think what you're beginning to see is if we set these rules right, that the connective nature, the security connections between our two places will become more prominent and more secure as well.
So some good news, Ambassador O'Brien. Ukraine, Europe has finally woken up. I mean, it only took the prospect of freezing to death in the wintertime to do it.
Well,
What say you?
We hope they don't freeze to death this winter. But look, I think one of the real exciting things that we have going on right now is that Ukraine has been a clarifying moment for the people who love freedom and liberty and democracy around the world. And if you think back to the last time we had a bipolar world, we had the USSR on one side and the United States of America and our allies on the other side. But there was also this group of non-aligned countries. They called it the NAM, or the Group of 72 Countries, the non-aligned movement. And you had great countries that were democracies like India, Brazil, Indonesia, that decided they weren't going to side with one group or the other, but they were going to try and make their own way or try and leverage each of the great powers to benefit themselves. In this new era of authoritarianism, totalitarianism versus democracy and the rule of law, I don't think there's room to sit on the sidelines. And so one of the exciting things I think we can look forward to, Mary and Mike and the rest of the seminar members, is India, Brazil, Indonesia, these great democracies. India has over 1.4 billion people. It'll be the largest country in the world very soon. It will surpass China. Prime Minister Modi has been very sympathetic to the United States. We had great relations with him in the Trump administration. I visited India with President Trump. I know Mike visited India to see his counterpart. Brazil, President Bolsonaro is in a tough re-election effort right now. We'll have to see what happens there in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. But Brazil has 227 million people, and we visited Brazil. Great meetings there. We did not get to Indonesia, although I visited with President Jokowi. But we've got to bring Brazil, India, Indonesia onto the side of the great democracies, onto the side of the United States and Japan and Europe and Australia and New Zealand, and integrated them in. And I think that this Ukraine crisis, this invasion of Ukraine, as these countries have watched Moscow and Beijing and Tehran just walk all over the sovereignty and independence of their neighbors, and the most striking case being what's going on in Ukraine. I think that's going to help bring these great democracies onto the side of the folks that love freedom and liberty. And when that happens, it's going to give us a tremendous advantage. And just a quick shout out to my friend Dan Crenshaw. I'm channeling Dan tonight. I don't mean to take his trademark, but he always looks so good on TV with his patch. I thought I'd do the same thing tonight. So Dan, thank you.
So now that we're not on Zoom, we can actually have a conversation with each other, which is fantastic. So if you guys don't jump in, I'm going to call on you. So nobody said anything. Bridge, I'm going to go straight to you.
Bridge is never shy.
Yeah, never shy.
Never shy. Should be shyer.
But let's get specific about this. So so it's a clarifying moment, like
Right.
the ambassador says. Lots of opportunities to cooperate now with our European allies, as the secretary says. How? Give us some ideas.
Well, I think that's a big question. I mean, just building on what the Secretary and the Ambassador were saying, I mean, I think it is a clarifying moment. So there's encouraging the wake-up call, not only in Europe, but that countries like Japan, like South Korea, like Australia, also see that very bad things can happen and you need to react accordingly. I mean, look at what's happening in Taiwan. I would say that the danger a bit is that there's a sense that the problem has been solved, in the sense that, like, well, maybe there's this Ukraine model and everything will be fixed. So I think it's more of an opportunity that we can build on, but I don't think it's sort of like everything's hunky-dory, if you will.
Because without the U.S. and the U.K., there really wouldn't be enough weapons to arm the Ukrainians?
Yeah, I mean, without the U.S. I mean, let's be clear, the bulk supplier of the high-end systems that are delivering the good outcomes for the Ukrainians were the tools that were built by American technology, American innovation, and being underwritten by the American taxpayer today. That's clearly the case, and this is the point. A combination of naivete and greed, right, over 2 decades allowed us to get to places that we should never have allowed ourselves to be. And we were the only ones who kept a foot in the capacity to deliver precisely what it is the Ukrainians need, Europe needs today.
So all of this dialogue about, gosh, what will Europe maintain its spine over the winter? That's just a useless conversation to have. It doesn't really matter. It's still just us.
No, it matters an awful lot because they're going to have some real decisions to make, mostly economic decisions about how to behave. Some of this will be how they support refugees. I mean, there are lots of theaters in which this takes place, but make no mistake about it, the bulwark, the things that's holding this together remains sitting right here.
Now, seminar members, you can jump in. Monica,
Can I
please.
jump in? I think the clarifying point is really critical here, and it's not just for the West's leaders or even leaders in Japan and so on, our allies in the Pacific Rim, but I also think it's really clarifying for the general publics across the West and across Asia, because there are a couple of things here. I think a lot of the people are now awake, not woke, but awake to the fact that energy security is in fact national security. I think a lot of people assume that but didn't quite understand the mechanics of it until this invasion occurred. I also think a lot of people assume that any kind of conflict in the 21st century would be digital, it would be cyber. And so for Vladimir Putin to actually send tanks across the lands into Ukraine in an old school land invasion was something none of us really considered to be likely even, and yet he did it. So I think that awoken a lot of people to the reality that, yeah, an old school ground invasion by America's enemies into allies across Western Europe could be possible as well. And I also think, we're sitting here in the Nixon Library. Nixon opened the door to China in 1972. That was strictly a geopolitical calculation on the part of President Nixon. The relationship with China obviously has evolved and devolved over the years, and it's completely different now. But Nixon's calculation at the time was to use China as a counterweight against growing Soviet power. And the Soviets were expanding their nuclear arsenal at the time in the late 60s, early 70s, expanding their conventional capabilities as well as their geopolitical spheres of influence. So Nixon, in a genius move, opened the door to China in order to leverage that relationship against the Russians. And I think when President Trump came in, and Mr. Secretary, correct me if I'm wrong, Robert, correct me if I'm wrong, but his original view was a reverse Nixon, which is try to improve relations with Moscow to try to enlist the Russians, at least in some way, as a counterweight against growing Chinese power. And yet the president's enemies used that approach against Nixon. So they used it as a cudgel against him to try to stop him from doing it, stopping him from doing a lot of different things. To Robert's point about the rise of this new authoritarianism around the world, I think a lot of people see that now, both elected authoritarians and unelected authoritarians in the form of the globalists around the world, World Economic Forum, World Health Organization, these transnational organizations that are not elected that have such tremendous influence over the United States and our own policymakers. So I think all of this has really alerted people to the dangers, and I think you're seeing populations around the world now really attuned to what's going on, and a lot of them are hooked into the root cause of all of this, which is American weakness under this current administration.
Well, Alex Wong is on the line, and he wanted to jump in. Alex.
Yeah, just jumping. I'm sorry, I think I'm reverberating.
We can hear you just fine, Alex. Can you hear us?
Okay, I can hear you. I just want to jump back to what Bridge had said. He had, I think, thoughtfully said we should just assume that there's a Ukraine model and settle back and not take the steps to bolster our presence and interests abroad. I think it's instructive to actually concentrate on what the Ukraine model is. This is not simply us granting aid, granting equipment since February. This has been a almost decade-long effort to train and equip the Ukrainian forces, jointly plan with them for this type of defense. And that is really what has allowed this coalition or the Ukrainians to beat back what would have been, or what many expected to be, a quick Russian victory. I think that lesson has to be taken by not just us, but by our partners and allies, and look at other hotspots around the world where we can do a similar effort to train and equip and sow the seeds early, so we can bear the fruit later on. But I also think we have to make clear to any other would-be invaders and adversaries abroad that this is what we're doing, so that it acts as a deterrent.
Yeah, that issue of deterrence has come up so much in our seminars. Chris.
Sure, I just wanted to throw in a couple points because I think we haven't seen the end game yet in Ukraine, and we have to see how it plays out. And depending on how Vladimir Putin ends it, we may need the help of the Indians, we may need the help of the Chinese more than we realize at this point. And for instance, if there's a threatened nuclear attack, we're going to need India and China to weigh in on that. So that could affect the post-Ukraine war and what that model is. On the flip side, if we have an easy victory over Vladimir Putin that ends relatively quickly, that may color how we think of a potential war, at least how the general public would think about that with China and how we prepare for that war. Will we be able to be willing to make the same expenditures that we need to on defense to support our militaries in a potential war against China? So I think we sort of have to see how the Ukraine war plays out. And then I think another point, in terms of our allies are changing in many ways. If we look at what's happening in Latin America, the elections in Latin America right now are bringing some, quite frankly, terrifying results. I think that we see Latin America moving much more towards the left and away from our values in many ways. Maybe not on the authoritarianism, but on free markets and things like this. And do they move away from us? Does that leave an opening for China? So I think as we see these post-war pieces coming together, I think we're going to have to think about what alliances we can make. Maybe there's some new opportunities. Maybe it's with India. Maybe it's with other countries. But I think we have to consider that.
Yeah, on India, Monica, I think you had raised this, that's an opportunity for this administration and future administrations.
India is a huge opportunity, and it's certainly part of the Quad, which, Robert, Mr. Secretary, you were critical in establishing. But I think there's real geopolitical leverage to be gained with India that I don't think modern administrations have really exploited enough. I think that there is a closer relationship to be had there with India. They're the second most populous nation on the face of the earth, very high tech. There are growing relationships there that I think should be cultivated that haven't necessarily.
But they're really difficult, aren't they, Mr. Secretary?
Yeah.
I mean, it's great to say that we want the relationship, but it takes two to tango, right?
It does. It's complicated. Famous diplomatic term. No, the reality is, though, our biggest aid here, and to your point about upside or opportunity, is they can see Xi Jinping too. Mm-hmm. And while they it may be difficult, and they are a neighbor, and they are incredibly interconnected economically, they know. They know that the Chinese violated their border in the Himalayas and killed dozens of Indians. They know that this virus that impacted them so greatly came from that place. They are not naive to the risk that the Chinese Communist Party presents. What they need is an America that's prepared to provide the assistance for them, not financial assistance, but the moral persuasive assistance that says when it really gets bad, when I'm going to use an adult word. When it gets hard, that we won't walk away. We won't say, "Hey, good for you, Godspeed." Look, we also gave them a hard time on Russian weapon systems. Mm. It was something that I know Robert and I talked a lot about. They are deeply connected. Their historic armor of choice are the Russians. That's their equipment. That's what they have trained to, those standards. We have a set of rules that say if you buy Russian stuff, we have to impose penalties on you.
Cut you off.
Under CATSA. And so we need to be thoughtful about how we aid them in transitioning away from the Chinese model, which they can see as bad. They see what's happened in Sri Lanka. They see what's happening in the economic corridor in Pakistan. They get the financial connectivity and the risk that imposes. We have to be there, and we have to be sufficiently forceful and patient. And if we do those two things, then over time, their economy will be connected to ours in really, really important ways. And don't forget, there are hundreds of thousands of Indians working here, studying here, learning here. And they are folks that are actually working towards an objective that is different than the Chinese students that are studying here. And I'll leave it at that for this moment.
Wonderful. Well, it speaks again, though, to the ambassador's clarifying moment, which is that it's not just India that's woken up, or the countries of Europe. Kim, you and I were having a discussion about the Pacific Islands earlier. I believe it was the Solomon Islands that rejected a U.S. naval vessel port call. The Australians offered help for their election. They said, no thanks. We have some real problems there. I mean, is that also an opportunity? Because I don't know if certain parts of the Pacific Islands have woken up, but not all of them.
Absolutely. And Ambassador Robert O'Brien and I were able to travel all over the world and share a message that economic security is national security. And we need to be there right now. We need to be there with our partners and allies. Mary, you said to keep this high level and fun tonight, so I was cleaning out my grandparents' house, and my grandfather, Howard Logue in Marietta, Ohio, left me some newspapers from 1968 and 1969. So the time is now. Sock it. So I guess, is that some good advice as we go into the G20? It's going to happen in a couple of weeks in Indonesia, and President Biden's going to be there with partner and ally countries, but also with Russia and with China. A couple of weeks ago, I joined Robert O'Brien here at the Nixon Library for a big event celebrating Henry Kissinger. And I privately asked Henry Kissinger, what advice would you give to Joe Biden as he's going into the G20? And Dr. Kissinger said, we need to be giving some alternatives. And so I think the economic alternative is very important right now. We just saw, I saw in China Daily last week that China's EXIM, I was the head of the Export-Import Bank of the United States, but China's EXIM has increased loans. The first 8 months of 2022, they're reporting $178 billion in loans that they're giving out to all of these countries. And we need to be very mindful of that. And just like with the Solomon Islands, we need to be working with the Quad. And we hope that the Biden administration will be continuing on the work, but we need to hear it loud and clear, and I think the world needs to see it. The time is now.
Congressman Gallagher, you wanted to jump in.
Well, quickly on the subject of economic competition with China, I do think the two low-hanging fruits staring us in the face right now are a free trade agreement with Taiwan, as well as a post-Brexit gold standard trade agreement with the UK. I remember both the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson and former President Trump talking about that at the time, and I know the politics have changed on both sides of the Atlantic since then, but that's something we shouldn't lose sight of or give up completely. On the hard power side of the equation, as we see all these opportunities, whether it's with our European allies or with India, potentially to convince them to get rid of their Russian kit, it sort of all comes back to our ability to revitalize our defense munitions industrial base. And there we've seen the war in Ukraine expose a lot of supply chain vulnerabilities and limits to our capacity. For example, it's going to take almost 2 years to increase the supply of javelins from 2,100 a year to 4,000 a year. If you read this energetics report that we mandated in the Defense Authorization Act last year, basically they reviewed the energetics are things that make weapons go, propellants, explosive, pyrotechnics. Every weapon system depends on an energetic. It's very tied to conventional deterrence. Many of these are single sourced or foreign sourced to China. So part of this discussion as we seek to help our allies wake up, invest in their own defense, means we need to revitalize our own munitions industrial base, because as Alex talked about the lessons of Ukraine or the Ukraine model, well, I think one of the biggest lessons is that you need to stockpile weapons and munitions before the fighting starts. Otherwise, you risk running low or going empty completely in wartime. And there we still have a lot of work left to do.
Yeah, but of course the challenge is that you need strong economies, and we're entering a time of great weakness after our fiscal and our monetary excess. But I promised that I would keep this positive. So let's think a little bit about that. It's been mentioned by a couple of the seminar members that maybe we should be cultivating new allies, that there are new opportunities. Okay, India is, they wouldn't call themselves an ally, but they're a friend-ish. Who else is out there? I mean, should we be looking, for instance, to say Eastern Europe, which is so threatened by Russia and so much on our side? I mean, Robert, what do you say to that?
Well, one of the ways we can do that, Marion, it's a great question, is through the U.S. private sector. So when I went to the East Asia Summit back in 2019, Kim was there, Adam Boehler and others were there. There was a real sense among our Asian allies that maybe America was disengaged. And so I had our staff take a look at what's U.S. overall investment in East Asia and the countries that are covered in this summit. And the investment was over $1 trillion. It was twice as much as Japan and China put together. But it's private sector investment. It's not government investment. It's not state-owned enterprises. And so I think one of the great opportunities we have with all of these countries, whether it be India or Poland and the Baltics and East Asia or the Czech Republic, is getting our private sector more involved and interacting around the world. It's so much lower profile than the Chinese Belts and Road domination approach. And it has national security implications. So when you think of Ukraine at the outset of that invasion, the Russians tried to take down the comms for Ukraine. They wanted to make sure that the Ukrainians couldn't communicate with their troops up at the front lines, that the people of Ukraine couldn't communicate with each other. And what happened? It wasn't a government. It was Elon Musk sent the Starlink system, pointed his satellites at Ukraine, and then people said, well, you won't get the uplink boxes to them. And overnight, within 24 hours, there were pictures on the internet of trucks going in with these satellite uplinks for Starlink. You've got YouTube, which is an American company that the Russians can't take down. And so you've got Russians able to watch Zelensky and others on YouTube in Russia. So we've got a tremendous advantage with the American private sector. One of the things that concerns me, and this is, I don't like to be political on these issues, but it's a kind of a classic thing on the left, they're always attacking the U.S. private sector. And at a time when we're in a race for our lives against Beijing and Tehran and Moscow and their tech companies, we're trying to hobble American tech companies. And there are things about American tech companies we don't like. We don't like the deplatforming. We don't like some of the censorship. But it's those American tech companies that give us a huge advantage in our race against the authoritarian regime. So we've got to support those companies. And then through that private sector initiative, we're going to bring countries like Poland, the Ukrainians, they want to drive over the border to Poland and buy Apple phones. They don't want to have some crummy, Chinese model that the Russians are importing. We've got such an attraction with our great private sector, and we can't forget that. And I'll finish with this one point. Mike and I tried to, with the president, to ban TikTok and WeChat and some of these pernicious Chinese applications that are on many, many phones in America. The Chinese are using them to spy on us, to steal the data of our young people, to spy on their dissidents. We tried to ban them, and unfortunately, the new administration came in and overturned that ban, and the courts weren't helpful to us. India, after the invasion that Mike talked about on the border, when the Indian soldiers were killed and mutilated, banned 400 Chinese apps from India. That presents a great opportunity for American companies to fill the void, but it also shows that the Indians, as Mike suggested, are starting to wake up to the threat. We need to do the same here. And so my advice is rather than having Congress use a blunt antitrust tool to attack American tech companies, we ought to be attacking the Chinese tech companies, banning those companies, and then working with a scalpel to try and fix what's happening in Silicon Valley that we don't like as conservatives.
Yeah, that's right. So anybody who has TikTok on their phone, you should delete it. And if your kids have TikTok,
Yeah.
you should absolutely delete it.
I just on the point of friends and allies. By the way, thanks for highlighting our failure to get rid of TikTok, Robert. Appreciate that.
We came close.
By the way, the first time I spoke about this, I was Secretary of State, and I was on Fox News, and it was a throwaway line at the very end. It was the first time anybody with the administration had said anything about TikTok. I think I was on Laura Ingram's show. And I literally got phone calls by the hundreds over the next week from mothers across America saying, please, get rid of it. Very, very popular at home with the moms, get their kids' attention back. You were talking, Chris, about South America and Africa. These are places we, frankly, are going to need. These are big economies. Nigeria will be the world's largest by population country before too terribly long, still a relatively small GDP per capita, but important places. And frankly, we've let the Chinese just walk there. And it's partly been because we were afraid to use our true power. So I'll never forget, we were in a meeting with an African leader, and the president asked the African leader, how much of your product do you import from here? And down the table, word comes back, almost nothing. The president said, oh, how much do you buy from China? $1.5 billion, something like that. The president said, how much economic aid do you get from the United States? And I'll never forget this, and nobody wanted to answer, but the finance minister said $800 million. And then somebody from the other side of the table said, it's actually $975. And you can watch this African president saying, like shut it up. The truth is, right, we were providing them free money, and the Chinese were interacting with them and trading with them and gaining influence. They had their people on the ground. This is this is not the finest of America. Our trade is our lead element. We're happy to provide them financial assistance, USAID from State Department, all good stuff. But in the end, it's that commercial tool, and we should be demanding, in exchange for our goodwill, we should be demanding access to their markets as well. And we could absolutely do it, and we would create enormous opportunity with African countries. And we shouldn't forget our neighbor to the south. Your point about countries going left, you don't have to. You can throw a stone from El Paso and find a country that is moving in a direction that is deeply inconsistent with the enormous trade implications for the United States of America. And they're talking about nationalization of important industries. That this will wreak havoc on America's economy, but also reduce our security footprint in those places as well.
Bridge, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, well, I think, Mary, you were talking about sort of opportunities with new allies and partners, and there are those. But I mean, obviously, you know, we've got missions around the world with countries. I think another way of looking at it is new sort of types of relationships with allies and partners. I mean, formal treaty allies like NATO, but also partners like India or Vietnam or other countries in South and Southeast Asia. I think this is particularly important, and I think if we took a page out of President Nixon's playbook, I mean, I think if I were to try to characterize President Nixon's approach, very analytical. He had a clear sense of what our goals were, our strengths, a realistic assessment of our weaknesses, not, you know, as he said, we don't want to be a weary titan kind of tying ourselves down. You know, let's not self-flagellate too much. But an understanding of, you know, where we are, strengths, weakness, opportunities, and et cetera, and threats. And so I think in that context, I mean, if you look at his administration with Dr. Kissinger and others, I mean, they really tried to form new types of relationships with countries in Europe. I think we saw an example of that with a different kind of relationship with the Europeans, with Israel, with Iran at the time, and in Asia as well. And I think that's a sort of a lesson that we can take here. You know, if we look at a country like Japan, I mean, Mike was very rightly pointing to the tremendous problems that we face in our defense industrial base. And I mean, frankly, as an American, it's pretty infuriating to me that we spend 3.5% of all of our income every year, and we can't double Javelin production in less than 2 years. I mean, we can't produce more than a submarine and a half in a year. That's like a national emergency, especially given the military threat from China in particular, but other threats as well. But hey, maybe an opportunity here is, well, if we need scale and we need an industrial capacity, you know, who has a large shipbuilding industry is Japan and South Korea. Right now, there's problems with that from an industrial policy point of view that we should, you know, I think it's fair for us and right for us to try to bring a lot of that industry home. But we got a problem in the near term. We don't have 20 years to fix this problem. And so, you know, measures like the AUKUS agreement are very promising, but we can't just wait until, you know, we can produce Australian submarines in, if we're lucky, 15 years, right? But that model, especially on the technology side, on the production side, the munitions side, I think that's where, you know, I think we can look. And I think there is opportunity there. I mean, I think the government in Japan is changing. The new government in South Korea is much more aligned with us. I think, you know, ironically, in some ways, the new government in the Philippines, which is very critical geography, is more receptive than the Duterte government. Obviously, the government in Australia, even though it's changed hands politically, is still pretty consistent, I think, with where we need to go, the government in India. So I think there's a real opportunity, but we need to be prepared, and I think the Nixon administration did this. You know, look, we need to be prepared to re-examine some of our policies, even some of our, you know, shibboleths of, oh, we don't do that kind of thing, or we don't, you know, that's not how we do things. Well, maybe you need to change the way you do things to achieve your goals. And I mean, I think the Ukraine example is, as Alex and Mike rightly put and others have put it, is a successful example where we adapt to the problem, and it is quite successful. What I meant is more that we just can't assume that supplying somebody is going to be, I don't think we can rely on the Chinese being as incompetent. I've been really shocked by how poorly the Russian military has performed. I do not think it's prudent to assume that the Chinese will be as incompetent as the Russians have been. And that's not, I mean, the Ukrainians have been heroic and they deserve our support. I think the Europeans need to take a much larger role, commensurate with their interests and our need to prioritize Asia. But I mean, we should absolutely support them. But I think that's sort of the caution I have. But I think if we can build a more equitable, with us clearly in the lead as Secretary Pompeo, we have to be in the lead because of our scale and our vision, et cetera. But I think we also need to get countries to step up. And I think if we provide them the tools and the opportunity and the structure in a plastic-minded kind of way, I think we can do a lot.
So what I'm hearing is we need to recapture that kind of strategic thinking and the creativity of the Nixon era in terms of looking to maybe solve intractable problems, Egypt, Israel, in the same way that that the Trump administration did. And we don't necessarily have to do it through institutions like the UN that don't work. Although, to be fair, the current administration just had some big victories that not just one, but two UN agencies where we saw kind of pro-free world people winning. So that is good. So they're addressing established institutions, but there are also more flexible arrangements that we can have. Monica, sorry.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on your word about vision, because I think that's something that's largely gotten lost in this age of immediate social media and dealing with things that are right in front of your face. I was so fortunate to work with President Nixon during the last years of his life, and it always struck me that Richard Nixon was one of the very few truly visionary presidents we have ever had. And when people ask me what I mean by visionary, I mean a president who can actually see what the world is going to look like 20, 30, 40 years down the road, and as president make policy to anticipate that world in order to not just preserve America's interests, but advance them over time. Not too many people know that Richard Nixon was the first American president to order a top-secret review of Islamic terror. And he ordered the intelligence agencies to produce this document for him, and he ordered them not just simply to focus on Palestinian terror, which was very hot at the time, obviously, airline hijackings and things, but he wanted the actual Quranic roots of Islamic terror. He wanted a full breakdown, and that document was actually declassified after 9/11, so you can go and take a look at it. But this is what I mean about having a truly visionary American president, which we certainly do not have right now. I think in terms of your bigger question, Mary, about opportunities here, I think we can all agree that our greatest external threat, we have many of them, but it is the CCP, and it's a long-term threat as well as a medium range and an immediate threat. And their expansionist drive into all areas of the world is worrisome. I think, obviously, the Trump administration was paying close attention to it, but few prior to the Trump administration were paying close attention to it. And I wonder if there's a real opportunity for a new president, because can't rely on this one to do it, but to create a new Monroe Doctrine of sorts, particularly with regard to North America, Central America, and South America. And I know we're dealing with disparate regimes with disparate ideologies, but if you had a truly visionary American president who was willing to put in the energy to craft a very deft, diplomatic, and aggressive, muscular diplomatic strategy to bring the countries of this hemisphere together, at least with a baseline agreement on confronting the CCP, you could actually have a united force, at least with regard to that particular threat. But again, it's not going to happen in the next 2 years, so we do have to elect a new president coming into office, but I think that that should be a top priority with the kind of diplomatic energy that Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador O'Brien brought to their terms in office. But that kind of bringing together of like-minded folks, like-minded regimes and governments that are focused on that particular enemy, and waking them up to the nature of that enemy and what will happen if they don't unite with the United States to confront that enemy, I think that poses a real opportunity if you have that kind of visionary leadership.
This is great. We should be more positive more often. It's terrific. Christopher.
I just wanted to pick up on something Monica said earlier, and as well her point here, which is, I think with the United States, one thing that we've done really well is after World War II, we had the Marshall Plan. We rebuilt Japan, we rebuilt Europe. It was very successful. My grandfather, at the end of the Cold War, made a very good point. He said that it isn't just enough to win the Cold War, we have to win the peace. So in terms of new allies, new friends, new relationships, there will be a peace that comes out of Ukraine. How are we going to deal with Russia? And how can we win the peace with Russia? And can we turn Russia, which we did lose after the Cold War, we didn't win the peace with them afterwards, as we've seen with Ukraine and other issues. How can we correct that mistake and turn Russia at least into someone we can work with, hopefully a friend, maybe an ally? Is it possible? And how would we do it if it is?
Well, let's hope we get there. Let's hope we're not entering a new nuclear age with tactical nuclear weapons being used on the battlefield. You know, all of the comments that you've made suggest that, too, that it's sometimes hard for us to imagine a world that's different with a different kind of configuration. And President Nixon could do that. But, you know, I'm thinking of the Iranian protests right now. I mean, Iran did have a revolution in the late 70s, changed the face of Iran and the face of the Middle East. Should we be thinking about how to aid these people and change it back into a direction that would want a closer relationship with the West and our partners?
Yeah, we often think about things that are impossible, right? We think Chairman Kim will never give up his nuclear weapons, the Ayatollah won't ever go away, and Xi Jinping's there forever. In the same way that when I was a young soldier, we never imagined that the East German wall would come down, right? I literally left Germany as a young lieutenant. Actually, I was an old lieutenant at this point. But nonetheless, a very junior officer, and within 2 weeks of my departure, the wall comes down. I certainly didn't know about it. Maybe the captains and colonels knew. I didn't know. I don't think anybody anticipated. These days come. These momentous events do come. And, you know, who knows with what's going on in Iran today? My guess is the besieged gets it back under control. That's the safe bet. But there will be a day when
that's the secret police, just for
the Iranian secret police or the IRGC, they'll use violence to regain and restore order. But there'll come a day, right? And we ought to be thinking about what that day looks like, not just for ourselves, but for the Israelis, for the Gulf Arab states. What will that look like if there is a change in leadership in Iran? What ought that look like? How ought we to make sure that when America lands in its place after such a change, that we're prepared for that? You know, as I was listening earlier, you think about things you would never predict. Vladimir Putin almost certainly took a $20 billion pipeline and turned it into scrap metal. I think he believes that he is going to be on the outs for a long time. He was flowing no energy through this. There was still value there. You might ship energy 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now. And he said, nope, not going to do it. Going to close this thing down. I think there's real opportunity to communicate to the world that the realignment that he chose is something that somehow the Iranian people will make a realignment that they choose, and we need to be prepared for what that looks like. And, you know, there's teams, I'm sure there's teams inside this White House too. We had teams for what do you do, you know, the day after, what do you do the year after, how do you provide support when these things do go your way, when the break comes, when the moment happens. We ought to think about that, and it should begin with thinking about what the economies look like. How is it that we provide American economic power, our most important, most viable, most consistent tool? You can see, right? Look at the foreign exchange rates today. When chaos looms in the world, you should be long the dollar.
Everybody's buying the dollar.
Yeah, everybody's buying dollars. We saw what happened, right? A $2 billion tax change in Britain they had to walk their way back from because the British insurance markets were in deep trouble of unwinding. That wouldn't happen in the United States. There's the depth to our currency, the strength of our treasury. Those things don't happen. When these breaks happen, when these momentous occasions occur, we need to make sure that we've got leaders with vision for how to make sure America fills that opportunity.
So what are the other places then around the world where we have the potential for a momentous change? We've talked about Iran. We've talked about Ukraine. What about Venezuela or North Korea or some of these other problem spots?
Well, so I think there are a number of places. One thing I'd like to bring up, it's the second anniversary of the Abraham Accords now. And when Mike and I started working on these, and I started working on it when I was working for Mike as a hostage envoy, and we were doing work in the Middle East, and there was kind of this rumbling that there could be a rapprochement between Israel and some of the Gulf Arab states, and we kept working it, and I changed positions, and no one thought that you'd actually bring peace to the Middle East. In fact, that used to be a joke. People would say, well, that's harder than getting peace in the Middle East. Getting that deal done is harder than getting peace in the Middle East. And yet we did it. And one of the things, this goes to Chris's point about peace being valuable in and of itself. Sometimes we focus only on the geopolitical issues or the economic issues. But when you see bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs, and tonight's, you know, the start of Yom Kippur, and you see these celebrations taking place in Dubai, I mean, who would have thought you'd have young kids telling their parents, I want to do my bat mitzvah or my bar mitzvah in Dubai? I mean, that's pretty amazing. Or when you go up now to the Dome of the Rock or the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and you see pilgrims coming from the Gulf states to visit those places. So peace is important for that reason. But it's also important geopolitically and economically. And one of the things that Mike and I saw as we were negotiating these accords we'd gotten very tough on China buying U.S. tech companies here. And China was all over there. They're still buying farmland next to our missile silos, and they're apparently putting police stations in New York. But beyond that, they were buying our tech companies. And we tightened up the CFIUS process. And there were a lot of folks who didn't want that. They wanted the Chinese money to flow in. There were financiers who thought it was great for America to have China come buy up all our innovative companies. But we started to shut them down. So where did the Chinese go? They started going to Israel, because Tel Aviv is the second Silicon Valley. And one of the benefits of the Abraham Accords that people didn't focus on at the time, Mike and I talked about it, Jared talked about it, we briefed the president on it, is we had these massive capital funds, these sovereign wealth funds in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai, in the other Emirates, in Bahrain. And those funds are now investing in the Israeli tech sector, and they're displacing the Chinese. So we got peace for peace sakes, and it was the right thing to do. But we also had this tremendous benefit in going to Monica's point about the CCP being our greatest challenge of pushing China out of the second most important tech market in the world. And so if we think creatively about some of these issues, it may not be we may not have thought about the Abraham Accords being a play against the Chinese, but it is. And in fact, even trying to get the weapon systems and the platforms that the UAE needs to defend itself against Iran, that displaces Chinese and Russian weapon sales, provides more jobs for American workers here, and helps, as Mike talked about, helps bolster our defense industrial base. So there's if we're visionary and we think about things that people say can't be done, everyone says Middle East peace can't be done until you solve the Palestinian problem. We went around the Palestinians because they were never going to solve the problem themselves. You get these second-order benefits and consequences that can be great for the United States. And so, I still think there's more room to run on the Abraham Accords. I think Saudi could become a member. I think Qatar could become a member. I think Oman, Kuwait. So I still think there's more runway. It may not happen under this administration, but if under a Pompeo administration or a second Trump administration, maybe it will. So I think we've got some room there.
Well, you raise another really provocative idea, which is, what if the CCP is failing? The property market is exploding. They have rural bank failures. You have protests all over the country. The COVID lockdowns are crushing their economy writ large. They're going to grow not even as fast as the rest of, I think, East Asia for the first time in many, many years. So maybe we get a surprise there, and we get a free China. Kim?
So, Barry, I want to go back to Monica's point on lessons from President Nixon. So I don't know how many of you in the audience, and the Nixon Library is beautiful, and everyone must visit here because it's a great repository of history, but how many of you were at the inauguration in January 20th, 1969? All right, so the Evening Star.
Got a gentleman down here.
I don't know if you remember the Evening Star newspaper. That was the evening newspaper for those born after 1969. Information was hard to come by. So the Evening Star from that day talked about Richard Nixon, and I just want to share with you what a visionary he was. So it was an article in the paper called "Views on Asia Put Emphasis on Regionalism." And it's kind of fun. One of the most sought-after documents in the foreign ministries and embassies of Asia is an article published in late 1967 by an out-of-office American politician who recently had returned from a 2-month round-the-world tour. The article, innocently titled "Asia After Vietnam," appeared in the American magazine Foreign Affairs, which we have read as part of this seminar. We've read this article. And was scarcely noted except by a small audience of specialists directly interested in Asia problems. So here's where he's visionary. The article notes an ambition shared by virtually all non-communist Asian leaders. And this is quoting Richard Nixon back in 1967, persuading China that it cannot satisfy its imperial ambitions and that its own national interest requires a turning away from foreign adventures and turning inward toward the solution of its own domestic problems. So maybe it's regionalism that is the answer.
Maybe it is. Thank you. That's a fantastic quote. What a great catch, Kim. Yeah, wouldn't it be wonderful if some of these problems resolved and we didn't have to worry about the threat from the CCP or Iran launching attacks on Israel and our neighbors. Thank you. It was wonderful. Congressman Gallagher, you wanted to jump in.
I just wanted to quickly flip stop 2 points and say how sad I am not to be there in person. Among President Nixon's many foreign policy accomplishments, perhaps his greatest domestic achievement was attending the christening of Lambeau Field in 1957 as vice president. So he holds a special place in the hearts and minds of the people of Northeast Wisconsin. Robert mentioned the remarkable achievement of the Abraham Accords and listed some countries that potentially could be added to that mix. One that's come up recently is Indonesia. Now, we can argue about whether that's realistic, but the fact remains that I think there's a dearth of attention being paid to key countries in the Indo-Pacific. We tend to focus all of our attention on Japan, on China itself, on existing allies, but where's the next generation of experts in the foreign policy community when it comes to these key countries like Indonesia and the Philippines? I'm part of a generation of military officers who, after the invasion of Iraq, after 9/11, rushed out to learn Arabic and thought I was going to be doing Middle East stuff my whole life. My sense is now that's happening with Mandarin, but not enough when it comes to Indonesian, Tagalog, Hindis. We need to do a better job of sort of convincing that next generation to cultivate the deep regional expertise that's going to be necessary to bring some of these creative new partnerships to fruition. And then finally, I just want to foot stomp something I heard Rich Colby say, which is thinking about the creative use of existing alliances and partnerships, right? Just start with Five Eyes, right? Are we confident that we've gotten everything possible out of the Five Eyes alliance? Of course not. We're proud of it, but there's much more we can do. Rich mentioned the AUKUS agreement and quite rightly said that we can't just put all our hopes on the long-term promise of the Aussies operating nuclear subs that won't be fielded until the mid-2030s at the earliest. What are the short-term opportunities AUKUS brings? Now that we are no longer constrained by the INF Treaty because of Secretary Pompeo's brilliant work, what are we doing to field intermediate-range INF non-compliant missiles that we can put in places like Alaska or Australia's Northern Territories? Those are the creative uses of existing alliances that I think are really exciting and could unlock massive opportunities to bolster deterrence in the next few years.
What about using our neighbors, Canada and Mexico? What about them? Anybody want to jump in here? No?
Well, I was in Canada recently. I mean, Mike mentioned Five Eyes, and you look at, I mean, Australia is a tremendous, I would say, in some sense, in the lead among our allies, and of course the United Kingdom as well. But you know, Canada, I mean, if you look back, I always like to point out, you know, there were 5 beaches at D-Day, 2 of them American, 2 of them British, and 1 Canadian for a country that's 1/10 our size. We love to beat our chests about it, and you know, rightly so. But I mean, these Canadians can really punch above their weight. You know, I think if we're looking around the world at, you know, a lot of our allies, you know, I'm not sure how much we're going to get out of the Belgians, with all due respect to our friends in Belgium or the Portuguese or whatever. But there are a few countries that I think we can really hope to try to get more, you know, contributions out of. Obviously, Germany, Japan. I mean, you can see countries like Poland really stepping up, the Scandinavian countries. But I think Canada is a country that has a real tradition of contributions to collective security. A very noble tradition, actually. I mean, you know, they were in both world wars for the whole thing. And you know, they're really not where they were. I mean, they're spending, I think, about 1.3, 1.4% of GDP on defense. It's really anemic. And again, if we're talking about these scale issues that Mike was rightly pointing to, Canada's an obvious place where we can begin. So I think you know, more attention to Canada actually in this vein would be really productive. It's kind of flown under the radar, and a little, you know, friendly pressure from down south might go a long way.
But it's also striking, you know, to several of your points of just how much these smaller nations in strategic locations we should be paying attention to. We haven't even touched on Central Asia, which is now becoming strategically, geographically quite important, given that we're not in Afghanistan anymore. And they have some resources that we may need. And, you know, they're also sitting in between Russia and China and perhaps not happy about it.
Yeah, I think you traveled with me at least once there, maybe twice.
A couple times.
Yeah.
We froze.
It was winter, yes. Poor planning.
Deep winter.
These are important places. You've often had huge Russian influence, huge Chinese influence. Now that is now singular, although there will still be an enormous tension between Russia and China in Central Asia. We can do a lot more. This really does start to get at the resource issues, right? The natural resource issue, not just energy, but more broadly resources. And when you think about the alignment, right? Canada, huge potential resource provider. Mexico, huge outlet, huge provider. These are places where you can see Ukraine as a micro example of this issue of vision will require an understanding of how you're going to feed the world, the next billion people. And we talk about it. I'm a Kansas guy, so I know farming. Farming is an energy business. You put fertilizer in the ground, that's ammonia, nitrogen. These are all natural gas dependent things. The dream that we're going to do this, that we're going to have a safe and secure world and feed the next billion people on windmills and sunshine, is foolish and dangerous. Happy to make the transition. Give me 50 years. We got a shot at getting there. If you all have a technology that can pull it off tomorrow, let me know. We'll all make a bunch of money.
We'll invest in you.
But in the meantime, and the meantime is an awful long time, we need to make sure that we are the provider, the swing producer for this energy. We, the Western world, those of us who believe in freedom, property rights, contracts, the simple things, that we are the providers of these resources to our friends and allies. When we do that, when we're capable of doing that, and we can do that from Oklahoma and Texas and Pennsylvania and all kinds of good places, I don't know, maybe even outside of Lambeau Field, Mike, who knows? If we do that and do that well, we will give enormous assurance to our friends who are hedging their bets today because they don't believe they can count on the United States to help them turn the lights on for that next 100 million people in Nigeria or the next 20 million people in Malaysia or Indonesia. They are counting on us to be that producer and the conduit for the capital that will come and be required all across the world to actually deliver those products. They know that this holy grail of climate change is real and important and a long ways off from reducing a carbon footprint when you have coal power plants being built in China at a rate that is unimaginable doing in Pennsylvania today.
Well, we're running short on time, unfortunately, and we try to run on time. If you had to pick one country to focus our energy on to improve the relationship, which country would it be? Bridge?
To improve the relationship, I think the relationship that's going to be the biggest swing, where there's the most probably plausible variation, is India. In the sense that the Indians are, as you were indicating, Mary, they're proud. They got their own way of doing things. They noticed, for instance, I understand the Minister Jaishankar was pointing out the F-16 upgrade in the Pakistanis. They toe their own line, and I think they're going to be critical. I mean, frankly, we have a deep shared interest in presenting China with a multi-front problem in Asia, and we want India to be as strong as possible, and I think we have to keep our eye on the prize. If I could just say briefly, while we have the opportunity, I had the great honor of working for Judge Lawrence Silberman, who just passed away. He's a wonderful, truly a wonderful man, visionary, a courageous person, and he served in the Nixon administration. He was the Solicitor General of the Labor Department, and then he was Deputy Attorney General, I think acting Attorney General, and then under President Ford, he served in Yugoslavia. He certainly would fit right in with this crowd as a sort of an apostle, if you will, of conservative realism, so I just wanted to pay him homage. He just passed away.
Thank you.
Nicely done, Bridge, nicely done.
Monica, do you agree with Bridge, India?
Yeah, I would just say, too, I agree with you totally on India. It's a heavyweight country, and as we think about now that Russia is out of the equation in terms of using the Russians as a counterbalance against growing Chinese power, I think India fits that bill very well, and it should be cultivated for many reasons. And I also think the nation right on our doorstep, Mexico, I think we need to really work harder to improve that relationship. I understand we've got different regimes with different ideologies and governments come and go. But for a whole variety of reasons, the United States should have a much more constructive relationship with the Mexicans than we do.
I don't mean to put people on the spot, but I'll put them on the spot. Alex Wong, how about you? Who would you name?
Right, I think I would definitely agree with Bridge on India, but I think I'll go maybe a little bit of a cop-out here in a different direction. I think we should put energy into our large traditional allies, into ensuring that their strategic turns in recent years sticks. So I'm speaking mainly of Japan, of Australia, of Germany. Large capabilities, large willingness, but their recent turns to be more forthright in their own defense spending, in Germany in particular, has been very recent. We have to make sure that as a long-term trend, because we need them. We need to work together to balance the CCP militarily, but then also work out economic arrangements that are perhaps with a smaller group of the free world that are mutually beneficial and defensive against the kind of economic offense that we see the CCP pursue.
Okay, we are running low on time. Chris, really quickly.
I'm going to do a quick cop-out because I'm going to agree with Mike Pompeo on this, which is that I think Nigeria is a country that we need to focus on. Population's growing. There's this vibrant potential democracy, but growing democracy. And I think it's going to be a great economic opportunity. 1 in 5 Africans are Nigerian. That's only going to grow. So I think Nigerian will be the linchpin for Africa, and that's a growing demographic area. So I think we need to focus on.
Okay, Congressman Gallagher, just give us a name. Which country?
Without getting the semantics of country, Taiwan.
I like it.
Kim,
Well played.
do you have a country?
Well, this is like picking your favorite child, so it's not
Just pick
possible.
one. Just pick one.
So I'm going to just add some food for thought. I was
10 seconds.
a country we should build better relations with for economic reasons and national security reasons, Azerbaijan. It touches Iran.
That
and
is
Russia.
fascinating.
Right.
Okay, now we're going to go to the co-chairs. That's very interesting.
Turkey.
Turkey.
I feel like we're in the McLaughlin group. The answer is India, but I've just stated myself. But look, 3 small tech companies. We've got to stay on top of tech. Israel, Finland, Taiwan. We've got to win the tech war. Those are 3 countries off the radar that will help us win the tech war.
Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, that was your tour around the world for our first in-person Nixon seminar on conservative realism and national security. And I just want to thank everybody in the audience, everyone online for listening. All of these guys and gals are on social media, TV, radio, podcast. Please follow them there. Thank you. I'm Mary Kissel. Please join us again for the next seminar.